co-designing machine-actionable data management planning, maDMP. Okay, yep. Using ReDBox. ReDBox, okay. There was a little e. So at the University of Auckland, Simon, Esling and Yvette Wharton. Thank you.
Kia ora koutou. My name is up there. And this is Yvette Wharton over here. I'm a Senior eResearch Engagement Specialist at Waipapa Taumata Road. And Yvette is a Solutions Team Lead, but she's the technical lead for this program of work that I'm going to talk about. So she's here for the technical questions if we have time for that, so we'll see how we go. Now, the RDM Research Data Management Initiative came out of a RDM stocktake report. So we looked at the state of things at the University of Auckland, and we looked to create a more consistent approach to research data management. There were a number of suggestions, and this talk that I'm going to give is one of the initiatives that came out of it, but there's been a few others. There's an RDM policy now at the University of Auckland. There's also a research data classification standards, public, internal, sensitive or restricted. We also have a Pōtiaki Rangahau Māori in the PVC Māori office. We're seeking to be a Māori data sovereign institution, so just having someone there for Māori representation. So that's Jeremy Hemmer. He has been involved in this program of work. So we're going to look at the different streams of work. Now, there is the secure research environment, which is a governed secure environment. And sometimes they're called trusted research environments or data safe havens. I'm not going to say any more because my colleague Vinci is giving a talk on Thursday at 4:30, so go to that and you'll hear more about SRE, as we call it. And PIDs probably doesn't need any introduction. Persistent identifiers are the likes of digital object identifiers, so DOIs, I'm sure you're familiar with, ORCID. We're looking at PIDINST, which is an identifier for instruments, and also RAID as well, which is a research activity identifier. So these are two of the streams of work, and the one I'm going to talk to you about, drum roll please, is the machine-actionable data management planning tool or platform. And I'm not sure how many, it sounds like a few of you know about data management plans. We use maDMP and DMPs interchangeably, but just for a sort of an outline, they're great tools for describing and documenting your decisions. They're there to help you think about ethics and data sovereignty, funder requirements. They're used overseas a lot, maybe not so much here, and there certainly could be an uplift in its use. And the RDM policy does stipulate that those working with sensitive data at the University of Auckland need to have data management plans. So we're very conscious of those researching in the areas of sensitive data. So what we did was look at different platforms that are available. So at the moment we have a PDF form, but we wanted to use a platform. So we looked at DMP tool, or DMP Online and DMP Roadmap. They're sort of sister platforms. Data Stewardship Wizard and ReDBox, which it stands for Research Data Box. And we did a proof of concept series of videos and gave them to our co-design group to look at and to pick the one that they liked best. So we got them to look at different criteria, such as the landing page, how it was creating a plan, working with collaborators, the help and guidance, and exporting the DMP, and give it a rating out of 5. There were some unique elements to each of them, but we didn't get those rated, but we did note what people liked about each of these 3 different tools. And ReDBox came out on top. Now you're probably wondering, how did you create a co-design team? Well, or co-design group, we interviewed a lot of researchers and some research aligned staff in 2022. And we got a sense of what they were doing in terms of research data management, whether they used DMPs or not. Not many people did. They obviously managed their data, but not in a formal way using a DMP. And it was good to get some research-aligned services such as Ethics Uni Services, which looks at contracts and funding, and the School of Graduate Studies that look after our doctoral candidates, to get their input as well. And we asked all of them if they would like to be a part of a maDMP co-design group, and they all said yes. And that was, initially that was 24 of them. And we added a further 21 co-designers into the Teams environment, that's Microsoft Teams. And so we ended up with 45 in the co-design group. And what we wanted to do is co-design from the outset. So we wanted to create our own University of Auckland template. We also needed to be mindful of sensitive human data, and we looked at creating a separate template for that. And we also wanted to look at what kind of training material people would respond to, as well as support material built into the tool. So we were really going for a complete collaborative approach here. So what I'm showing here is our Padlet that we use. So it's an online tool that some of you may know about. It's sort of a real-time interaction. We did a lot of things on Zoom. And we weren't reinventing the wheel. That phrase has just been used, so I'm using it again. DMPs have a pretty standard structure to them. So we put up what all those three DMP platforms kind of had in terms of the layout, and that is typical project information. Requirements and considerations up there, just think of that as the ethics material. Data, obviously, collection, analysis, and then sharing and access and publish and report. So we got them to look at these different sections and then order them and what would make sense. And then we had subsections, and then we had fields. The two highlighted ones there, title and description, are two examples of mandatory fields. So we tried not to have too many mandatory fields. So those highlighted there. And we moved things around and consolidated things, and basically in real time reformatted things according to responses from the researchers in these co-design sessions. And we actually had two of them for the generic template. Then we did it again. We used that template, but we met with a subset of clinical trials researchers and data managers. So they deal with sensitive human data, and we talked to them about what they required. And the highlighting here is nothing to do with mandatory. It's more what's unique to sort of clinical trials. And we could see that there was a lot of administrative burden for them because they have protocol plans. They have something called a data and tissue management plan, which is not a data management plan, but very much sounds like it is. So there's a little bit of overlap with some of the content in what they need to fill out. Then, of course, there's the ethics application. So there's a lot that they need to do, and I think this is still going to be a work in progress. But we need to get something together because we wanted to pilot ReDBox. And I'll try, I'm not even keeping track of time, but I probably should.
It's okay, I am. You've got 9
Brilliant. Yeah, I'll try not to race through. There's some more content coming up. So we looked at training, having a workshop about training, and just what we should focus on, what people maybe didn't know as much about, things like ethics and rights holders, mātauranga Māori, especially other Indigenous data, open access, IP and copyright were mentioned. There was also some discussion about long-term stewardship. That's more of a higher level discussion at the university, so not something we entirely covered, but it was good to get people's input on what we could think about in terms of upskilling and training and what to focus on. Then we talked about, you can't see everything here, obviously it's a screenshot, but we also went into the types of training that people would like, in-person, online. We do a lot online now because it's very easy via Zoom. Quick versus comprehensive guidance, and things like self-directed or using videos. And then we were considering targeted help at particular stages of the DMP as well. So just getting everybody's input and feedback. So what we ended up doing was create short videos, and we did create a comprehensive guide. The researchers are very much interested in a cheat sheet or FAQs or even exemplars, but we wanted to run the pilot without creating those to begin with, because we want to test the platform, and then we could get some information from the pilot to maybe go back and create these sort of shorter guides and FAQs and exemplars at a later date. One thing that came through is that they didn't want to have workshops any longer than an hour. So when we talked about the timing of workshops, because researchers are time poor. And the idea was to also have a mixed group as well, so don't separate doctoral candidates from academics at all levels, just bring everyone together so they can share what they're experiencing. So that's a training, and then it was the support material too. We have something called Research Hub. It's where all things relating to research, most things I should say, there might be a few things not in there, but it's a great resource, and it's a portal really to find all the services, research-related services and information at the University of Auckland. And of course, people don't know what they don't know, so we were thinking it's an opportunity to build in some of this Research Hub material. And that image of the clock tower there, that's just a link that goes to a Research Hub page, for example. And how we should sort of begin things, what kind of landing page we should have, what it should look like, and outline for them very early on what's expected in a DMP so that they're prepared when it comes to filling it out. We can also point to particular relevant support services as well. So we really wanted to integrate as much support material and help text as possible into the DMP itself at particular stages. And the idea of all this collaboration was really to get representative feedback from the research community. So while not everybody came to these workshops and sessions, we always shared them via email and in the Teams environment for feedback from the wider group that I mentioned before. And yeah, everyone has their different ideas of what the DMP is going to provide for them. Oh my goodness, okay. Let me shoot through. So we got to ReDBox. We also were collaborating with QCIF, which is the Queensland Cyber Infrastructure Foundation, and they're the creators of ReDBox. So we were working with them to sort of change things for us. And of course, we had someone in-house do some style changes. So ReDBox became what we call Blue Box, where we put in the University of Auckland livery, made the changes, embedded our templates. We also got them to create something called connected services. So we wanted to embed some connected services, for example, requesting storage. And also, we didn't put it into the pilot, but we want to be able to initiate ethics application, and we want to push data to institutional Figshare. And in the future, they can request maybe virtual machines and more computing power via the DMP tool. So it's kind of got quite a package in there for them. The pilot phase. We did a pre-pilot meeting with everybody who was involved. Numbers sort of stayed the same, but different people got involved, and 8 of them had no prior knowledge. So we made sure that we had people coming to this that were not part of co-design. So they were seeing this for the first time, and that was really interesting. We gave them a kind of pre-pilot package, as well as we got them to fill out a survey before they did anything, so we got a sense of where they were at. We then got them to do a 2-hour workshop, which of course goes against what they would have liked, so we'll look at that in the future. But just to bring them up to speed with research data management, and also they did a ReDBox introduction in our version of ReDBox. And then we had a post-pilot survey, and there was some drop-off. We had 15 researchers at the end, started with 20. But we got really good feedback about it being intuitive, easy to use, plenty of useful helper text and guidance. They gave it a 4.6 out of 5 rating. And then some constructive feedback about the ethics section being quite arduous, but it simply is. But what we can do to actually, finesse that, and certainly working with the people in clinical trials, because we've got some ideas of what we can do, and if there's time, maybe I'll share that with you. We've got some ideas of how we can make that those different ethics applications work. What I really want to get to is our before and after. So not long now. So we had all these before criteria that we were checking on. So the top bar and the bottom bar is before and after under the CARE principles, which is around Indigenous data, if you don't know that, collective benefit, authority to control, responsibility and ethical for Indigenous data. But you can see the others, copyright, data publishing, data sharing, and generally there's a great uplift. So even just using the DMP tool in the pilot, people learned a lot. What was interesting is ethical requirements actually, while it went up a little bit, you could see it drop back in terms of good and excellent. So some people realised they didn't know as much as they thought they did. That's what we're assuming. But we'll ask them, we'll get back to them. We haven't shared these results yet with the pilot participants, and we'll point that out to them and see if people put their hand up and say, yes, that was me. I sort of realised that there's a lot more to it than I thought. And these are the other things that we were testing before and after. And another interesting one was IP. Intellectual property went backwards, 5%, no nothing, went to 7%, so that's interesting. So again, they might have realised, wow, there's a lot more going on here, and I didn't actually realise. Last slide. Next steps. We're writing up a report at the moment for the governance groups. There's more than one. It goes up the chain of command. But looking at developing a sort of operational business case for this, because things did go well. We've got to obviously feed back to the researcher community, the co-design group, and the participants, and then make changes and keep developing it. And there's more integrations we want to do. That's what makes it machine actionable. And that's it. I'll leave it there.
Thank you so much, Simon. We do have time for a question or two.
Thank you. That's really interesting. So once you've created the researchers created the DMP, what kind of assessment and approval process have you got, if any?
Yeah, if any. There is. Do you remember you'll tell me the metric that we can use to completeness is one of the criteria that we need to make sure that they're actually filling out what they should. So there are ways of checking that. I am looking to Yvette, she's kind of knows more about this sort of thing. In terms of checks and balances, it does come through to us, and we have a number of things that we can do to interrogate the DMPs and then feedback. Do you want to jump in?
Kia ora. I'll just add to what Simon said. A couple of things. This is obviously a pilot, and we're moving into what we can have from an enterprise and operational point of view. So we'll be making recommendations as part of the operational business case around what a service model for data management plans could look like, seeking guidance from our governance group for decisions around that. We've done some testing of the Belmont and Dart metrics around actually having people eyeball the system, what people have entered, and possibly meaning you could target where you help people into those areas where they're less complete. We've also looked at pulling the information out of the DMP and producing reports more autonomously in that space, which is a cruder measure of completeness at this point. So there's a lot of stuff we can do in that space. It really depends on where we end up operationally as to what the support model would look like. Doesn't quite answer your question, but it's a work in progress.
One more question.
Hi, that sounds really amazing. I'm kind of at the start of trying to figure this all out for my organisation. But what machine actions are you doing, and what more ones do you want? You've put all this effort into making it machine actionable. What actions?
So the storage, there's lookup records, so there is drawing things in so that people don't have to fill things out. And so the more that we can connect to, so if they've filled out a grant application and they're used persistent identifiers, then if they're systems we've got and we can access them. One thing we liked ReDBox because of its ability to integrate. The other two potential platforms wouldn't integrate as well. So we have got someone in the team who's a developer that's using APIs to tap in and draw things across, and so that's part of it. It's pushing it as well as we can to things like the ethics application. But obviously with ethics, there's sort of versions of record with the ethics. So as soon as something's submitted, it's locked and it's a process to unlock it. So we have to be careful with what we pull from and push to as to what we're allowed to. And then of course there's external places to send things to, and we don't have any control there. But the things that we did do, it's sort of like we did a mock-up for the pilot, but we really want to ensure that there is storage requests. There's those things that I pointed out, ethics application, beginning an ethics application, just sort of initiating, that's the word I'm looking for, and other things like requesting compute power, VMs, things like that, so that people feel that they're getting something out of using the platform, because if they're going to have to use it anyway, they might as well be able to sort of do other things with it. And the help and the intuitive help side of things is, I think, much appreciated. Stop there.
No,
I'm not trying to promote it to the crowd here.
I'm going to add and say, I have a dream. So I think there's a lot of stuff that we have in systems already, enterprise systems, that we ask researchers for all the time. So that's one of our big aims, linked to the persistent identifiers, so things like RAIDs, so we can push and pull information far more easily without asking people to enter storage and that sort of thing every single time. We can have it so that, you know, a PhD student enrolls, we already know a bunch of information. It comes into the system. Hey, look, here's a DMP for you to start filling out. Think about what you're going to do in your research project. Oh, you need storage and you've classified your data as sensitive. Here are your storage options. Would you like us to provision that? Off it goes. And all the way through to a DMP isn't something that you just set and forget. It's something you should come back to. So you're constantly coming back to it and adding to it, or even, actually better, we're adding to it programmatically, so the researchers don't have to. So all the way through to, oh, actually I want to publish my data in Figshare, for example. So we can actually take the information we have and push it to Figshare. So the right way through. That's the dream.
Thank you guys so much. Do you want any closing remarks?
No, good luck out there.
Thank you so much.
This afternoon's session, it's a BOF, so Birds of a Feather. Yvette Wharton from the University of Canterbury, that was a mistake, University of Auckland, and her wider team are presenting. It's a collaboration cafe, sharing sensitive research data management practices. So over to you, Yvette.
Kia ora, everybody. As it says on the slide, this isn't just me standing here for an hour trying to entertain you all. What we're really hoping to do is have a conversation with all of you. But we're going to start that off by giving you a few sort of general talks around a little bit of the international context, have a few people go through and tell you about their journeys. So Claire over there from Nessie is going to tell you some of her experiences. Laura from University of Auckland is going to give you some examples of some things that are happening in Auckland. And then Vincy and Sarah, who are working studiously down here at the moment, are going to take you through some things that they've been doing around training and support and some of the work they've been doing. And then hopefully you'll all move forwards, so we're all a bit closer, and we'll have a little bit of discussion about a few of those topics. But before we start, how many people have phones, laptops, something that will connect to the internet? We're going to use a little tool called Padlet. So if you scan the code or put in the little tiny address, what that should hopefully do is take you to a little page. And what we're really hoping to do is the very first thing on the left-hand side. Introduce yourselves to the large variety of people in the room, but online. So tell us a little bit about you, where you're from, and we have a little bit of thing in the office about some of us really like tea and some of us really like coffee and others of us like other things. So tea, coffee or something else, what's you? The way you use the Padlet, just hit the little plus that's underneath the introduction and then you can start typing something in. And hopefully through the magic wonders of the internet, we might see some things coming up. So the reason we've asked you to do this little welcome introduction, partly, we're really keen to know who's in the room. And the other reason is we want to use the Padlet so that if you have, we're going to do a few short presentations, and if you have thoughts, ideas, questions, you can put these into, hopefully, the categories that we've put up there around data classification, policy, training support needs, sharing data, publication, and sort of anything we might have missed. So if you have thoughts that stimulate you as you're listening to what someone's saying, click the little plus in here and add it. And we'll come back and have a look after the discussion, after the presentations, and hopefully have a short discussion, long discussion. Is that a big thumbs up from everybody? Are we all good? Software carpentry, this would be a green sticker. So I'm going to try not to talk too long because I can, but there's lots of examples of where frameworks and work is being done internationally around research data management and sensitive data in particular. I've just put a couple up on the slide here. So NIST are doing some things around a research data framework. There's some really cool stuff going on by UK DEAR. There's the Tree FX project, which is taking an RO crate and turning it into an RO crate that you can have a lot of stuff around the governance and metadata for how that can be shared and who can use it. Open Eras in Europe have done a sensitive data guide. A little bit closer to home in Australia, the ARDC, we have some of our friends from across the ditch here at the moment, and they've done a really nice piece of work, which I'm going to go into a little bit more detail, and forgive me if I'm saying things that are wrong, you can correct me, around creating a research data management framework across universities and secure platforms. And I put PIDs up there. There's a lot of countries doing national PIDs frameworks, and I think that's something we could look at. So just a little bit of depth into the ARDC example. About 25 universities got together and did a whole bunch of work looking at what they might do collaboratively around a research data management framework. And I think it's a really nice piece of work, a nice piece of collaborative work. It had 9 elements that were an immediate focus. One of those elements was sensitive data. For each of the elements, they had, if you go to the site, there's a summary, there's some background, there's lots of recommendations and calls to action. So it's a great way to start and think about what can we do as a university, and I think it's something we could look at in New Zealand as how does this fit with us and what we're doing. In the sensitive data example, they had a series of recommendations, things around classification, defining protections so that it's really easy to know if I'm sharing data with another university that actually you've got the same protections for that sort of data as we do. Some things around guidance for researchers and guidance for ethics committees, and also having those classification levels. Most universities, if you look around, have begun working on training and information around sensitive data. If you go and have a look online, there's lots of stuff that you can point your researchers to. We have things like the HDEC template, the National Ethical Standards, data.gov has some information. And then locally, we've been doing a lot of work locally around advice and support. Also, in terms of thinking about identifiable versus de-identified data, there's lots of frameworks out there around that, and I don't want to spend too long on it because I want to discuss it all with you. We've done a lot in the 5 Safes framework in the work we've been doing. How many people is 5 Safes something they know about? Okay, so maybe we can come back to that later on. And actually, locally here in Aotearoa, there's the Ngā Tikanga Paihiri framework, and that has actually been mapped in Stats NZ to the 5 Safes framework. So that's me. I'm going to leave it there in terms of international examples. If you know things that are really good examples, feel free to put them in the Padlet. And I'm going to hand over to Claire to talk about genomics data. And is it sensitive?
Kia ora, and thank you for having me as part of this event. So I wanted to be a little bit provocative and just ask the question of the room, really, for us to discuss a little bit later. But is genomics data sensitive by its very nature? Is this my genomic sequence, and can you tell it's mine and only mine? Purely from the sequence and not from any anonymization that's been done to any of the identifiers. And I think when we look at sort of security breaches and cybersecurity attacks, looking at using sequences and breaking those identification models to identify individuals, and vice versa in terms of knowing the person, knowing the individual, and then looking at potentially sensitive information about their sequence, like disease state and so on, and further implications to whānau, with obviously, especially if it's heritable mutations, and also with things like health insurance companies and knowing that. So that's the question I want to propose for you to think about in the next little while. Is it sensitive by definition? And then I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the ways we share genomic data, and I guess, again, to think about which sharing mechanism is appropriate in which circumstance. So this is stolen from a Nature Reviews genetics paper, which I think nicely highlights some of the main ways of sharing genomic data. And I think this probably has parallels with quite a lot of other data generally. So we have centralised repositories with complete open access. There's a lot of these internationally, ENA, NCBI are good examples. We don't have, at least in the genomic space, national repositories like this. I think we do have, now as a few years ago, this sort of centralised repository that has a data access committee, so it's got some level of governance around access to that data. So I guess AGDR is a good example in New Zealand, and there are plenty of other examples internationally. The sort of clique sharing or collaborative sharing within a consortia. Again, I'd be interested to hear of examples within New Zealand. I think there's sort of useful examples overseas, but I'm not sure actually on this model whether we see this a lot happening in New Zealand. But I think what we do see a lot happening is the kind of sharing on request. Researcher knows another researcher. It's a small community. You're looking at one aspect and you think you'd like to see that data for a comparison, and really reaching out and sharing it without any overarching governance other than through that researcher directly. So I think depending on the circumstances and depending on the sensitivity of the data, each of these mechanisms can be more or less appropriate. And I think this is maybe a useful framework to think about depending on our views of sensitivity on genomics. And really the last point I wanted to, I guess, highlight is a massively huge topic. So Maori data sovereignty and governance, and just, I guess, pointing out, one, I'm not at all an expert, and there's some really useful resources for those, I guess, also new to the subject, but also, I guess, the importance not to conflate it with sensitive data as though the topics are very much the same. And so I think there's a useful framework that we learnt about considering Maori data within I guess, a tikanga framework of tapu or noa, so kind of sacred or not sacred, and that could sit quite nicely alongside perhaps a Western data classification system for considering where it might fit in without having to try and conflate the two topics. And I think I'm passing on to Laura at this point, who is going to segue into the University of Auckland perspective on where this fits in. So thank you.
So I have one slide, so I'm going to talk to this. Just as a heads up, I will be talking about the University of Auckland's research data management policy development and implementation on Friday. So if you've got those kind of questions, you can say them. From Yvette's point of view, from the international bit, I just wanted to touch on that international trends around privacy, security, sovereignty, and trusted research, which we are now experiencing within New Zealand. How does that translate into our institutions? So from an international point of view to a national point of view, what is the direction of travel that we're trying to achieve? That national into local translation, so New Zealand government have a data classification which is public, internal, sensitive and restricted. We've adopted that within the University of Auckland, as have other institutions within New Zealand. But that sensitive, how we've defined that, is quite specific in its relationship to ethics. So in our institution, that definition of sensitive data has a specific relationship with, does it require ethics, full ethics rather than expedited ethics? And that has led to some frustration and confusion with our researcher community. Going to Claire's point, our Māori research governance group have decided that just because data might be about or from Māori does not make it sensitive, because they did not want research about Māori or from Māori to necessarily have that extra hoop just because. When we were writing our research data management policy, the data classification work was happening alongside it. So it wasn't within research data specifically. So the institution has taken on that classification for all data types, which is great because we're all on the same playing field, whether we're talking about academic and educational data or administrative data or research data. And it also makes it much easier to collaborate with other institutions, because when we talk about sensitive data and Vic talks about sensitive data, we ought to be using the same classification, for example. How does that relate to our policy? So within our research data management policy that only came into effect middle of last year, we have a risk-oriented approach. So when data is defined as being sensitive or restricted, the policy requires that you have a data management plan. If it's public or internal, you don't have that requirement. Doesn't mean it's not recommended, but it's not a requirement. So that sensitivity of data is translated into both policy and then increasingly, and this is work Michael is doing, what systems should you be using for what types of classification of data? So is that storage solution appropriate for that type of data versus that type of data? And have we got authorities to operate for those different solutions or systems for those different classifications? And lastly, with the data management planning tool that Simon and Yvette were talking about in the earlier session, yes, people tend to write a data management plan when the data they're working on or working with is sensitive. But are they doing that out of a need for compliance? And is that the wrong way to get our researchers to engage with DMPs and to think about how they document what they're doing, how they share that across their research group, and how that enables them and us as an institution to give them the systems, resources, processes that they need to make their boat go faster. Sarah and Bincy, I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. And I'll take it over from here. As part of storing your sensitive data, the university is now started an initiative on secure research environment. So as part of it, we have a co-design workshop where we have invited stakeholders from both academic as well as research support team. So we have an active co-design workshop for SRE. So we are conducting different kind of interactive workshops with them to understand the use cases which will be needed for an SRE before we start organizing the resources for a secure research environment. So one of the co-design workshop was to find what was needed for the training the user would be requiring for using an SRE. So we asked them what their expectations are from such a training, what's the training structure, who should be the audience, and what level of training they would be requiring, what's different modes of delivery which would be appropriate for the end users. So what's listed down here is different feedback we got from the co-design team, which was very useful. And one thing which particularly stand out was when they were discussing about sensitive data training, they wanted 2 sessions. It was one concentrating on the general aspect of the guidance around managing sensitive data. People wanted to know more about these themes and topics of data protection, classifying the sensitivity of data as such. So one of the themes here using REDCap, Sarah will talk a bit more about it and explain what we are doing in that space. Sarah.
Tēnā koutou. All right, my job is to tell you briefly about picking up on one of those threads, the request from researchers to want to have more understanding and confidence in using ReDCap, particularly around sensitive data. This hasn't happened yet. This is work we're doing this year, so I can really just tell you about the outline of what we're planning to do. Just give you an example of how we're tackling one of these threads. We're partnering up with the Human Health Research Services platform at the University of Auckland, and they actually, up until now, are running one of the instances of ReDCap at the university on a funded basis. So researchers can sort of contract them within their research funding budget to run their ReDCap database for them. We want to be able to enable researchers to make more use of the self-service platform, which it currently has very little instruction and directions and training for researchers. So we're going to attack this in two different ways, really, by using a tiered 101, 201, 301 approach. The 101s to increase awareness for researchers across the university about how they can use ReDCap to support their sensitive data needs. So we're holding a series of online sessions across the year, and those are mostly short around case-based, user-based scenarios of where they might find ReDCap useful to them, how they access it, very general, not actually teaching them how to use ReDCap, but to increase their awareness. And the 201 and 301s are both in person or perhaps later in the year online, to be determined based on how researchers want to address that. They are half-day workshops. The 201 to teach creating surveys and forms, so to increase confidence to capture data and to manage their data efficiently, and the 301 to learn how to use the dashboards and smart variables so that they can increase their confidence to use ReDCap for recruitment, for data entry, and for management. So there are our plans for ReDCap this year. If you guys have had any experiences similarly around that, then let us know in the Padlet and the discussion, and I'm going to hand back to Yvette to start that discussion. Thanks.
Back to that Padlet. So we're really interested in hearing your thoughts on some of the things that we've said in the presentations, anything that your organisation is looking at from international best practice, any data sharing processes you have, any patterns that you're seeing, what you've got in training, what you're not even sure you don't know about. So what questions you have in these spaces. So I'm going to jump back to the Padlet. In the meantime, if someone has a question, we have 2 mics. So if you want to run around and...
It's your time to shine, guys. So you've got plenty of time too. BOF can't happen, it needs a discussion. So please feel free to ask whatever you would like.
So I'd be really interested to know what are people being asked for in terms of sharing data? And in fact, what do you term sensitive data? So those are my first 2 questions I'm going to pose to the group. How do you determine sensitive data? Do you have a risk classification framework in a similar way to what we've got, or is it something else? Who's brave enough to answer that?
So we as in, I'm from UNSW, so it might be slightly different to what you guys are experiencing here, but we have a Privacy Act which defines what sensitive information is. So when we use small letter S sensitive, we refer to that as the Bible, right? So that's the sensitive personal information. I believe that's the New Zealand equivalent in the Privacy Act. But we also have UNSW data classification standard that divides into 4 different categories. And very confusingly, we've made the decision to call one of those categories sensitive. So we use the capital S to describe that particular case. And that actually is not sensitive in Privacy Act, according to Privacy Act. So there's that confusion that we have because we're using the same word to describe 2 different things. So I just wanted to throw that out there. Another question that I had for the room is that one of the recent changes that we had at UNSW was to not just the nature or characteristic or the ontology about what the data is, but the amount of the data also contributes to the risk. So we had a new risk framework that said if you have highly sensitive data, it's okay if you have less than 1,000 people. Then it would be a medium class risk. So you can use the right tools and the practices according to that medium rating, rather than the very high end of things. So we were using that arbitrary 1,000 persons data to be the cutoff. I wondered if anyone else had a case like that, where sensitivity as a characteristic or nature, but also on top of that, the volume of it or the number of people affected by an unwanted disclosure would actually push the risk a bit further or down, things like that.
That's an interesting one. I mean, I totally agree that the more people that you have in a study, or the more information that you have, you could argue that it increases the risk because the exposure is higher.
But it's not a risk. It's not a risk that increases to the individual in those studies. It's a reputational risk to the institution. So that's kind of a different thing.
But we don't care about the individuals, that's the problem, right? All the policies are written to protect the institution. It's the reputational risk that, or at least for the UNSW policy, the sensitivity is described as unwanted disclosure having an impact on the reputational impact on the university. So I think I think you've really hit it on the nail, that we don't really. However, having said that, the complexity and the richness of the data that we have about a single individual could also have a very high impact on our reputation. So there is that limitation that we currently have with the number of people, because we can have a single person, full genome sequencing with all the highly identifying details and the sensitive data about their political views and all sorts of things could also lead to an institutional reputational risk as well. But yeah.
But in our definition of sensitive, we talk about that reputation to the university and harm to any natural persons. Don't know what an unnatural persons is in that context, but that is the way it's worded.
Wallace, what happens in Otago? I'm picking on you now.
Why couldn't you pick on any of the other Otago people that are here? So I would say right now it is very decentralized what happens to sensitive data at Otago. We are further behind on the journey than you guys are at Auckland as far as having centralized policies and management and even solutions around sensitive data. Is that fair to say? My Otago cohort here? Yes. So there are groups that do this better than others at the university. But I mean, even just recently, we've got a bunch of work going on and reviews going on around the Dunedin longitudinal study, if anybody's aware of that. Over, 70 years or something like that. 50 years they've been studying a population of people, intense amounts of medical records, intense amounts of data there. And we've done some real analysis around using outside parties and other things around their database and how the data is stored, how it's accessed, the security around it, those sorts of things today. And to say lightly, it didn't come back great. The review didn't come back great. But we knew that going into it. And it's really giving us a lot of, I want to say ammunition, but a lot of push and visibility to the fact that we do need to really start tackling that from a higher, more centralized level, and that individual research units don't necessarily have the rigor around data security and data stewardship that they may need to have given the type of data that they have in their particular part of the organization. Another interesting thing that came out of that, me being somebody so I run infrastructure at the university in ITS, so I provide the platforms for the University of Otago. And one of the things that came out of there that was very clear, there's a lot of recommendations around our central file storage system. You should change this, you should do this, you should do that. And really at the end of the day when we analyze it, actually that data shouldn't be on our central file platform that we've got. It's not appropriate for that. but also making that platform that secure is also not appropriate either, because we would break all sorts of researchers who use it in a less secure way that don't need it to be as secure for their workflows and that sort of thing. So we've definitely identified that there is a gap at the university around the platforms that we are providing, and also definitely around the policy and how we handle that. So I don't look for the University of Otago to have a beautiful built-out solution today, but we are very rapidly working on it right now.
I think it's a journey for everyone.
Yeah.
We might have policies, but we still have researchers that need a lot of training. So these devices, right, they come with apps. When you start one, you approve something, and off your data goes somewhere in the cloud. There are those that aggregate these, and they on-sell them. And we've had at least 2 researchers come to us with data they purchased cheaply from some random about mobile use around New Zealand. And it's detailed enough that you can see which house someone lives in the morning to which place they go to work. So it falls in a very questionable category. And not only have they managed to sell it to 1 researcher, but it's managed to sell to 2, and I have a rumor about the 3rd. So they're hitting the researchers and selling the same data again and again. And then the researcher get a little bit upset when we say, we really don't think this is good data and we shouldn't be storing it here, because just because you got it cheap somewhere in a dark alley doesn't mean it's good stuff. So, yeah, sorry.
I think Wallace has another comment. I have a question in there once we've finished this discussion around actually, could we be better at how we think of sharing data and the ways that we do that? So, synthetic data or data spaces. And there's a lot of things that we could be moving towards in the way that we actually think of data. Anyway, sorry, Wallace.
No worries at all. This is a conversation, not the Wallace show. So moving on to what you said there, that's very, very interesting, because one of the things that we are definitely finding, I would say learning, some of us kind of already knew this, but it's definitely being reinforced, is that training and engagement is key in the middle of this, because we can make all sorts of policies, we can make all sorts of processes, we can be very collaborative in the effort of building those out, but unless the researchers who are coming into the organization, who are doing the work, and that actually know how to implement them, and are willing to do so, that's always going to be a huge challenge and our biggest gaping security hole. The thing about getting data off of mobile phones and stuff like that, if you read the news, the CIA and the US just got, I wouldn't say in trouble, because it turns out what they were doing was totally legal. The CIA and the US isn't allowed to do wiretaps and stuff like that against US citizens. They're only allowed to work externally. But they just simply went out and bought all the data off the market on US citizens, and were using that. They weren't breaking any rules, because there was nothing in the laws about you could just go out and purchase this stuff. They weren't actually wiretapping anybody. They were just purchasing the data, and it was better than what they were tapping in a lot of cases.
I think there's a whole space in there thinking about, is the thing I'm doing ethical, actually?
I don't think the CIA worries about that too much.
So thinking about training, what training do people do? Are people doing training in any way, thinking about what is sensitive data to your people, or how should they treat it, or what are some considerations in that space? How do we make sure we are using frameworks? Is anybody out there using something like the 5 Safes in training, or other frameworks? So one of the things when the larger we, that's not me, that's we, when we're telling people around research data talking to people around research data management and thinking about sensitive data, there is a large focus on human health, because a lot of it has privacy concerns. But there's also ecologically sensitive data, commercially sensitive data. There are other sensitivities. Laura?
His opinion on banking or policy or racism or hate speech, they're all sensitive topics, but they're not health data.
But when you say sensitive, that's a again different definition to the Privacy Act sensitive data, right? So what are you using that word in a broader sense according to which source of truth, the Bible? Which is the source that you're drawing that from? Is it just from experience that, oh yeah, that seems to be sensitive because it contains information that are innately sensitive? Is it a generalized agreement as to what that is? Just a question. Yeah.
I wasn't planning to carry the mic and talk to it. We've, at the University of Auckland, used the New Zealand government classification. So to a certain extent, it's how they've defined sensitive. But we had to mesh that with our existing classifications, different terminology, across Uniservices, which is our commercialisation arm, and the university, and across data types that were beyond research. So then the definition got tweaked for what is pragmatic within our institution, hence that if it's expedited ethics processes, that's not sensitive for this classification. If it's a full ethics process, then it is. So there's a mixture.
And interestingly, we have talked to researchers as part of the work we've been doing who've been somewhat frustrated that certain types of data aren't seen as sensitive in terms of actually what I'm doing, you know, this particular soil sample with this particular set of information, if information got out while it's not, it could have potential harm to a person as well as the information collected about me specifically.
Right. So, just going back to the topic of training, UNSW has been running research data management online training, which is an on-demand system that we've been running on Moodle. Yep, that is the right tool. I get confused with Canvas. But one question I wanted to ask the room was, do you find any competition within the organization for the space of training? Because we have been running this research-specific data management online training, but IT has released another cybersecurity training, which is general data management. Well, it has elements of data management, but more like phishing, how to protect against phishing and all passwords and all of that, but also has elements of data sensitivity and classification and things like that embedded in it. I think you've touched upon how the classification has to kind of wiggle its way into the corporate data, not just the research data as well. So I wondered whether I personally felt that there was a bit of a competition in the space because, as someone else said, researchers are very time poor. We don't want to just give them training after training after training. So I wondered if anyone else had those experiences.
So just in response to that, David, so I'm from the University of Otago, from the library, and so we've been running programs for our emerging academics around research data management, and so we don't try and convert established academics, because that's just a bit hard. But really all we can talk about is good principles, because we don't really, as Wallace said, we haven't got good systems or infrastructures or policies to kind of point them to, but we're preparing them for a world beyond Otago where they will have to address these things. But we can't cover, it's so big, we can't cover it all. And so I think it's not because we're being territorial, but we just kind of focus on our bits. And I know that there's, IT have been doing in the past training, but it's kind of, it's ad hoc. And what we're trying to do at Otago, and what Rasha was talking about before, if you were listening to Rasha's presentation or were here for that, is trying to join the dots and provide something that is more comprehensive, but also hearing, a 2-hour workshop is really, or a 2-hour training session is beyond most people's kind of interest or time. So I think we were just talking before that, what's in it for me as an academic? What's really going to change my life? And for a lot of us, it's around our research culture at our institutions, and that's even bigger. So I don't have any I don't have any real answers, but we are doing the training, but it's just skimming the surface. And so we have to think of how we can do this more cleverly or smartly. And online options are great, but a lot of our people are just not engaging there.
Who would like to venture what would impact their behaviours? Otherwise, I'll pick on you.
That was a loaded question, Laura.
Take away their grant funding or their travel money. One of those two things will work. But I think it is, I really do sympathise with that idea that you start with the younger academics because the old ones are too hard to change. They do say that academia progresses one funeral at a time. And I think sometimes that's true. But I also think that catching up with that reticence is policy changes that are coming through from funding agencies. We already see this at Auckland from funding agencies that are based overseas. You can't have this money unless you are compliant with these standards, and that means that your researchers have to be certified. We will see that eventually, I think, from local funding bodies too. So I think that stick might sharpen some focus.
Anybody responding to the NIH's request for sub-awardees to hand over data regularly? Wallace, how's that going?
Oh, do I really want to answer that? Yeah, so that we've had a couple of those now come in, and we are definitely struggling, given our very immature state in this and our very decentralized model that we've had in the past, to actually respond to that in a way that they're expecting us to respond to. So yeah, but I think as Mark said, this is going to really, given the lack of very strict guidance here in New Zealand, a lot of these researchers that deal with the National Science Foundation or NIH or any of these other organizations around the world in the US or in Europe are going to start to feel the impacts of this stuff no matter what, and are feeling the impacts of it today. And that's actually very positive for us, because then that puts it so that it's not just IT, it's not just the library that's pushing all these things, that the researchers are actually now coming to us and saying, I got to be compliant with all this stuff. Can you help me with that? And that's in a positive conversation, actually.
I guess as a senior academic, I can respond. And also, I've come in from the UK, Imperial College, and I believe, I'm not 100% sure, but I believe the college was told that they may hit a rather large fine if we did not all do this online training. And so we all did the online training, so you do need a bit of a stick. But I must say that once I'd had the online training, I became much more aware of it. And if you can do that, I can start teaching my postdocs and my PhDs, start asking them those questions that make them think about their data. And I guess for me, I'm on the other side in that I work in the materials field, and so the danger is in working with military or commercial companies, and so some of my data is related to chemical weapons, some of my data is related to explosives, and so that data has to be kept very secure as well, but in a different way, and knowing where your data has, not just where it's being stored, but whose server it's gone through, because I can't send it through an Amazon server in case it goes into a country outside of the UK or the EU security requirements. And so I think as you become more and more aware of international regulations, I think you're right that the academics will suddenly start to realise they really need to tighten things up here.
So another UK person, very resonate with that. And our university, in order to be able to get us to do all of this export control, secure data, also I'm at a university that was hacked and ransomware, so they're seriously keen on this, is if you hadn't done your training online, all your access was revoked to everything. Oh. Your email stopped working. And that caught a few people out, but you know what they learned? So it was really strict. So we weren't just told we're going to get into trouble, the university will get into trouble. Basically, all your rights went, and then you did it. So we got every single senior academic to do all the training. Well, that or no email.
Michael, that feels like a challenge.
I'm going to just come back to the training and the kind of disconnect in the amount, the different groups that do training. There have been a few surveys done at the University of Auckland of all of the different groups that provide different pieces of training around the university, and there are a lot of people, and it isn't very connected. So it's often done in small groups with small bits of information. So there is a piece of work going on looking at researcher skills development and trying to coordinate that more. But it is a really hard space because there's such a diverse set of needs, and it's such a changing and evolving space for much of it. So I think there are key groups of people that can deliver skills training depending on what it is. It just requires better collaboration and less silos across universities, which have traditionally been in place, I think. Do other people find that? Sort of siloed training, and it's not that people don't want to work together, it's just they're trying to get on with their own bit of work and educate people in their given area.
Just from the enterprise side of things within IT, we launched a cybersecurity training program, and amongst the academic staff at the university and researchers, about 40% did the training. And this is mandatory training, although there aren't any punishments yet around not doing it. But there does need to be a very large culture change within the organization, and there also needs to be a real realistic investment from the top down that this is something that has to happen. And unfortunately, this is my 5th university now, that usually happens after the institution has been hacked or compromised in a very serious way. I'm hoping that's not our fate or any of the other unis here in New Zealand, but that is typical, unfortunately.
About 2017, I did a project for the University of Melbourne called the Peterscale Campus. Now, I've interviewed a lot of researchers over the last 20 years. It was the very first time the professors said, if data management's a problem, what's the university's solution? Why is it my problem? I don't have to provide the power for my instruments. I don't have to connect to the internet. Why is data management my problem, not yours? And I think I like sensitive data because the unis can't stand back. And I think 15 years ago, even 20 years ago, when we set out on this data journey, no one had any data services of any kind in any institution. And so we said, it's a researcher problem. But no researcher can install the systems you need to provide permanent access to their data. And so sensitive data is a really good test case for us. I think if I was a researcher, I should take my maDMP and say, I fully comply with my university's data policy, full stop. How could you possibly say that's completely unsatisfactory?
But you have to make sure you are complying with that policy.
Well, I think training is important, right? And you have to compel training. But so the other thing I'd like to add is I really like the word classification. We desperately need to understand the different classes of data. And on sensitivity, there's reputation, there's legal risk, and there's ethics risk. 3 different classes. Right? But why is it a researcher's problem to comply with the law? Why isn't it the institution's problem that they comply with? My employment contract should say I can't do anything else with my data other than what my university policy says. Now, I told you that to stop the room.
Is it a shared responsibility?
How many of you work in institutions where the majority of your researchers refer to the data as their data? That's the answer to your question, Reese.
I have another provocative question. Who here has done a course on RDM? Like a proper course, not just I've read a couple of articles on the internet. Hands up? Like really up? Like all the way up?
All the way up.
All the way up. So like we're talking about research data management, and I would say that half of this room has done a course on it. And I've just done the course just before Christmas, and it was like an online one. It was a really good one. It was on Coursera. But what institutions are creating their own content, and should we be leveraging one, or should we share? Should we create one for New Zealand? I don't know. So I'm from University of Canterbury. I'm Jamie Hart. I was going to put my hand up a little while ago to say we are also very early in our journey, Wallace. Very early. We're drafting a policy. We're working with cybersecurity. So this is for David, I think, who had a comment. At this stage, we're just grateful someone else is training. If cybersecurity is doing some training for our researchers, we'll happily jump on the bandwagon and say yes, please, while we collaborate and do something for the rest of the university. But I think we need to move away from a them and us attitude and more of a oh great, someone else is doing this too. How can we work together to actually make it a joined up experience?
We need to wrap it up.
Yeah, we're going to need to wrap it up. I'm going to have one comment I'm going to say. Then maybe we can continue the conversation outside. There's a really nice piece of work that's been done, again, by a group of Australian universities, where they've actually come up with a research data management training framework, and then you can take that and adapt it to your situation. I'm trying... Pico? Pisces. Yeah, it's really lovely in terms of it. There are probably others in the room who can speak more to it, but it's a lovely piece of work in terms of being able to have something we can all share, but then also bring in your local context. Yes, and Wallace is saying come back after the break and have more of this conversation.
Great, thanks Yvette. We have a short break now just to stretch your legs outside. Back here at 4:30. See you then.
Thank you all for participating.
So it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Wallace, who's going to be carrying on sort of the data theme, but in a slightly different way for the next SPOF. So thank you.
Just so you know, my suggestion was to bring the drinks earlier and bring them in here so that we could have this BOF session with refreshments, but no, that didn't happen. So carrying on from our last discussion almost, here where that was a little more targeted towards secure data management and those types of things, I'm going quite a bit broader. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Wallace Chase. So I'm the head of IT infrastructure for the University of Otago. I'm the one that kept talking so much in the last session for you guys who were there. And I'm coming at this from a very IT-centric perspective for some very good reasons here. I've also got, helping me out with this is Darren Hart. Darren, over there, who's the manager of research and teaching IT support at the University of Otago, coming at it from much more of a researcher angle as far as direct researcher support as far as me, where I'm more on the enterprise side of providing the systems and the platforms and those types of things there. I am the evil central IT. Okay, so the question that I have, and this is a very broad question, is do I have a problem to be solved? And this is what I'm going to be asking all of you here as we go through this next little bit. I have a couple of slides, and then it's all on you guys to basically help me out and to answer this question of do I have a problem to solve? Okay, so at the University of Otago, we have many different data storage solutions that ITS offers centrally and that departments have had traditionally over the years. For those who aren't aware of the University of Otago's structure, in the last 5 years or so, it's gone through a major centralization of IT, where individual departments had their own IT, everything's collapsed into central IT now. Moved all the people a couple of years ago, didn't move any of the systems at all, and now we've slowly gone through the process of actually moving all of those distributed systems in. So we've got a whole bunch of different storage platforms in that, although we're down now to only a few outliers, I think Darren would agree there, from the main systems. One of the things that the University of Otago, though, had done very well about 8, 9 years ago, the Dell folks in the room can tell me when the Isilon originally stood up at Otago, but probably 8 or 9 years ago I think we've had it, was to actually bring in a platform which we called HCS, which is a Dell EMC Isilon, A lot of places use that for high-capacity data storage. And we have 3 main clusters. We have one in Dunedin, one in Wellington, and one in Christchurch. For those of you who know, we've got 2 medical schools that are in both Wellington and Christchurch, and then the main one in Dunedin. So we have to have this provision in all 3 places at the moment to have good access for the researchers there. So it is not backed up, but it is replicated, and I'll talk more about that in a minute and bore you guys with some technical details. And then we also have another dedicated cluster that has Weka.io on it that's getting stood up right now for some higher speed research demands. So the graphic that's over on the left-hand side there is representative of the storage, and this is a combined graphic from all of the clusters. But as you see down there on the bottom, you'll see the individual different schools within the university. But what I want you to pay attention to is not so much the exact numbers, but pay attention to the colors. Because that light blue represents 24 months 24-month-old data, so data that hasn't been accessed in over 24 months. So there's quite a bit of that across all the different departments and fields there. And the red and the yellow is anywhere from 3 months to 9 months. So that's 0 access of the data. Hasn't been clicked on, hasn't been used, hasn't been accessed, hasn't been modified, hasn't been changed. Okay? So you can see a good percentage, probably almost 70% of our data is in that older than 24 months category. And that's a bit explainable in the fact that we've had our storage array for quite a long time, and it's been running, and it's been a very popular service as well. One of the reasons it's been so popular is that we don't charge for the service. So we do not have a bill back model. The university used to way back in the dark days, but does not have any sort of bill back models now for ITS services. They're all centrally funded, and this is one of those services. If you guys were here in the last session, you'll also know that the University of Otago is on the beginning stages of our journey. I have another word for it, but on the beginning stages of our journey is the politically correct one, I'll say, when it comes to research data management and actually managing our data. So remember, we've gone from a very decentralized model into a very centralized model. So it's still really the individual research departments, units that are handling that, and we're moving towards a more centralized model. So remembering back to that question of do I have a problem, let me just go through a next slide here, which is a bit busy, but I'll just kind of talk you through it. So what's the size of this? So the size of this, speaking from a strictly IT perspective, is, if we talk about the utilization of the cluster, we've got about 31 petabytes available on the cluster, and about 20 petabytes of that is used today, has data on it. Now, that's not to say that we have 20 petabytes of unique data, because remember, this is replicated, not backed up. So we basically have 2 copies of everything. And this is important because when I explain this to folks within the university, especially when budget time comes around, it's a difference that makes a difference when you have these conversations. So one of the first things to remember as well, if you're an IT person and you're into storage, you know that at about 90%, the cluster actually starts to degrade in performance, so you don't want to run it over 90%, although a year or 2 ago we got it well over 90% for a little while until we were able to get some more gear in. It's split across 4 different clusters, so as the example here, having 8 petabytes free isn't much good if it's all in Christchurch and the demand's in Dunedin, for instance. And lastly, as I said, it's replicated storage, so your file takes up twice the room that you actually think it does when you put it on there. And that's a question as well, and that's kind of a service level question that ITS has, is that replicating everything is great, because if one cluster goes down for maintenance or if something happens to it, bam, you don't even notice that it's happened as an end user. Your data is still available over on the other side. Because we're not backing up the data in a traditional backup sense, we've also got some geographic diversity for the data's here and the data's here type of thing. But that does instantly basically double our costs because we have to have twice the size of storage for this. Okay, so it's misleading to say we have 8 petabytes free when it's more like 4 petabytes free. So as I said down there on the bottom. You could say it's either 20 out of 24 is in use or 10 out of 14 is probably more realistic for what the university has. Okay, now going over, this has been our growth year on year from 2015 for data. It's pretty interesting. You can see the impact that, kind of that delayed impact that COVID had on everything, and we see that across all of our systems. We see that across bandwidth utilization on the network. We see that across every single system that we've got, that dip. There's some really interesting analytics that come out of that as far as what happened when we had COVID. But you can see in 2023, we're right back on the trend. So if you draw a trend line on there, we're right back on the trend, and that is basically 3 petabytes of growth per year. Is what we're experiencing here, and that amount of growth is increasing year on year. And the Dell guys are happy with that because they get, we just more. I'm going to pick on them because they're sitting there. All right. So, do I have a problem? Is my question, and this is a problem. This is a question that I ask quite a bit as an IT person here. Obviously, we can continue to fund it. It is not cheap to run this system. And any money we spend on this isn't spent on something else that the researchers have. Is this normal? Is this good? Researchers love it because they can just plop their data on there and walk away. And if they want to come back to it 7 years later, it's there just sitting for them waiting like anything else. But that's my question for you guys. Is, do I have a problem as an IT person here? Well, we could talk about personal problems I may have later, okay? So yeah, so what do you guys think of my situation, where at the moment I'm spending in the neighborhood of north of $4 million a year on this? Vlad.
Just one question.
Sure.
How much is the replication seen as a sufficient substitute for backups? Like if something goes wrong and malware starts deleting files and they get deleted from all replicas, they are gone.
So we have some level of protection on the cluster for events. Like that sort of thing. But it is replicated storage. It is not backed up storage. It is what it is. If you go in and delete your stuff, it will delete across both the clusters, or if your stuff gets deleted. Backing up data is very expensive, though, especially at that scale.
Does it create a compliance problem? Because you need to keep some data for you.
Well, this is research data, and remember, if you were here for the last conversation, and I was talking about the woes of the University of Otago, we don't have good research data management policies right now. We're working on them. We're getting there. So when somebody audits us, and when we look at it, my answer always is back that ITS doesn't know what's on that system. We don't know what the data is there. You need to go and talk to the individual share owners, and there's about 2,000 shares on the system, which is either a research group or a lab or a whole department or a division in some cases. So if you want to know about the data on there, you have to go and talk to 2,000 share owners. Do I have a problem? Oh, I plan to. Well, I love how all the talks so far have been just feeding into each other here. It's almost like we all have the exact same problem.
I'd say you have a problem because, well, depending on who you listen to, the amount of research data that institutions are holding is growing at 25 to 50% a year. So you're going to run out of money. I think that's a problem.
I already have. You've seen about the University of Otago in the news in our financial state, right?
I have, and now I know why.
Yeah. I'm probably going to get more questions next year. I haven't been keeping track of who's next. Sorry, but I'll go with you.
Can the users see how much storage they have used? The reason I ask this is because in my institution, once we exposed how much each group was using, it was a big surprise to people. And then they started saying, oh, we don't need that, we don't need that. And we were able to get rid of a lot of stuff.
Yeah. So one of our big things over the last year has been to get better reporting on the system. I can now produce these graphs that were just not even there before. The engineers on the back end would see them, and they'd grumble about them and that, but nobody else out in the university saw them. And we started to cascade those down now from the very high level of working at the PVC level and working it down as far as who has what. Can the users see that? Absolutely. They can see how big their individual shares are, but they have to actively go in and do that. So right now we're working on getting reporting out to where we can start reporting on this, because I know next budget cycle I'm going to get more questions than I've ever gotten before as far as what I'm spending here. And what I fear, having been in other universities, this is my 5th university now, that have had chargeback and billing models, and Darren can answer this question as good as I can, what happens when you bill a chargeback for a service like this? People build their own. Exactly. I can do it cheaper at Newell Leeming. In fact, he did. He was part of the problem before he came into central IT. Yep. Which still has to move on to this, really. It hasn't moved over here yet. So there's still 1.2 petabytes in naughty storage that has to move over. Who else?
Wallace, I have a comment.
Sure.
I have the microphone, Laura, sorry.
I'm not going to get in the middle of that.
We're talking very much, you know, I have to pay money because I need to buy infrastructure.
Yeah.
I think there's something in there that I think we could come back to around actually the way we're buying infrastructure is shifting quite a lot from actually being CapEx to OpEx, which has a completely another, it transforms that conversation. So that's another conversation within the universities that we're trying to solve at the moment is actually the budgets for some of this.
Yeah, if I have to start paying OpEx, then the fact that that data is just sitting there forever, and some of that data we know the people who own that share aren't even at the university anymore. So that data is there. No one can access it, and often nobody within the department or the lab even knows what it is anymore. So does IT just go in and hit delete?
So I'm kind of asking the question.
Because if you ask the department head, they'll say, oh, no. We have to keep that. Well, what is it? I don't know. But we have to keep it.
Are we actually asking an infrastructure problem, or are we actually asking a data culture?
Well, I'm coming at it from the infrastructure guy, asking an infrastructure question that I know is a data culture question, and setting you guys all up to tell me that.
You know, if you had data management plans...
Right? It's almost like that's what we need.
It's almost like what you need.
Yeah.
I know there are issues making data management plans that work, but in the best view of data management plans, they at least do tell you who owns this data and why they own this data, and possibly when they can delete this data. It at least gives you a place to start to try and chase up, can we delete it? Because I think without them, and we're in the same position as you are, we have a mountain of data, most of which we have no idea what it is, and it's probably rubbish.
Yeah.
But we still carry it around.
How much of that data do you guys think is rubbish? I believe that too, but I'm also not willing to hit the big delete button. Yeah.
Run a deduplication.
Yeah.
Hi.
So deduplication is actually an interesting one, and here's where the Dell people again will have an opinion on that. So running deduplication over this data often doesn't result in almost anything, interestingly enough. So it is unique data in its own way. Now, it may be the same genome sequence done 37 different ways or something like that, and the original's right there, and you could redo it and get all that data right back. But deduplication isn't the answer. So there's a couple up in the back there, yeah.
Hi, Wallace, I missed the beginning of your talk, so I'm sorry, but maybe you've answered this. Is it?
Well, you know my name, so you got the first slide, so.
Yeah. I saw you in the program. Is it because you don't feel that you have the power to make a decision on stuff that you can neither describe, characterize, or even point ownership to? Or is it because you're, you are disinclined to take on that responsibility?
So put yourself in the shoes of the lowly person in central IT who doesn't know what any of this data is, has no real record or anything. I mean, we know who has access to the share, but we don't know who's created the data or anything about it there. If you go and just hit delete, the first time you delete something that actually was millions of dollars worth of data that was been in cold storage from some research experiment 8 years ago that is now super critical and somebody wants to access it, do you put yourself in that position?
Sure. No, I get that. It's a very compelling argument.
I don't get paid enough to put myself in that position.
Right. Okay. I think that probably answers my question better. Have you tried a strategy of maybe turning something off and see what happens?
All the time, not with this particular thing, but all the time. So we have a lot of servers around the university. Like I said, going from a decentralized model to a centralized model. A lot of the people who ran them have left. Nobody knows what they are anymore. And how many times do we just turn stuff off and see who yells, Darren? I'm going to call on Kate next as the resident librarian in the room.
So, I mean, libraries have been dealing with this for years and years, collecting books and not getting any bigger libraries. So we have had to make decisions, and they've been really, really kind of, not happy decisions, angry academics when we start throwing out books and journals, and it ends up on the front of the newspaper. And, we try and avoid that, but we're trusted to make those decisions, mostly. And it is usually a financial decision, but it's also about keeping the collections relevant. I mean, this is a very similar thing. And at some point you have to say, to get more space, you're going to have to get rid of something, which is what we've been doing and engaging with academics. So at what point do we say there is no more space until because it is the HODs at Otago who are responsible. If your department wants any more space, first you have to get rid of something in there, and you're going to have to take responsibility for tracking it down, and if you can't, get rid of it. And will the world implode? There's a small risk. But at the end of the day, we have to start making some hard decisions. And I think you force it back to the HODs, but you can't keep getting more and more space because there isn't any more.
Well, and as we move into, again, that OPEX model, we're in a CAPEX model right now. As soon as we start moving into an OPEX model, as I said, that cost then follows you forever if you're not doing anything with that stuff. And that's a problem. David.
Yeah, so have you tried the idea of fighting fire with fire? Just make an announcement that you'll copy everything to USB drives and just leave it there for a while. Anything that's sort of not active, and that could be a sort of softer version of just switching it off. Actually, it's actually semi-serious because, I mean, again, tiered storage would be something that at least some proportion of researchers would be able to label things with, even though there weren't research data management plans. But it's really then obviously a question you've got to profile where you're going to get the biggest impact first. So you need to sort by your user sizes and everything. But I presume that's already on the cards.
Yeah, so tiered storage was interesting because we had tiered storage within the cluster. And it didn't work very well because things would get archived off into slower tiers of storage, and then somebody would try to use it. And often they'd only just be accessing it real briefly or something like that, and it would take a while for the tiering then to drag it back, and by then they're already done doing it, but they've had the slow experience. So there probably are technologies out there, and it's advanced a little bit since the last time we tried it, but we actually had a pretty terrible experience with tiered storage within the cluster. Now we have thought about some things like a more manual tiered storage thing where we simply just slice off those light blue sections and move them over to another thing. There are universities in the US who have gone full in just in the last couple years on giant robotic tape libraries to do this sort of thing. all are options, and all are options that make engineers really happy because we get to build a big thing, and robots moving tapes around is cool because you can point at something that's, you know, moving in the data center, and that's more exciting than flashy lights. But is that the right answer? I'm not sure it is, because that data still is it useful? We're still spending a bunch of money on it. Is it useful?
Yeah, okay. I work for a Crown Research Institute, so we've got a worse problem because we can't delete the data because of the Public Records Act.
Yes. Yeah.
But
well, and we have some of that too.
Yeah, for your
we just
corporate
don't
stuff.
even know if some of this stuff falls under that or not, because we
yeah.
don't know what the data is.
Yeah. So I mean, I've got a couple of things going around in my mind about what's getting moved into repositories because it's linked to a publication, about tiered archiving. But the other one is how readable some of that old data is. Because if it was created in proprietary software which you no longer have licenses for, if it's software where I can think I used to work in the area of GIS, and the older data is really quite difficult to read now. So you've kind of...
Some grad student wrote a program 10 years ago.
Yeah.
And
so you've got I'm not disagreeing. I think you've got a heap of problems here. I'm now very pleased that we back up.
I was going to just comment on that too, also from NIWA, so Crown Research Institute as well. Those numbers scare the shit out of me, to be quite frank. And we have tiered archiving, we've got tape, and we have a culture that NIWA owns the data. None of those things solve any of these problems. So I'm not convinced that anything other than telling researchers that if you want to store data for 6 years, we're going to start charging you per gigabyte per year is going to make a difference. That's the only way you can solve this distributed coordination problem, is with a price.
how do you then solve the problem of the researchers saying, well, then I'm just going to put it onto my little NAS array and shove it up on the desk shelf in my office or at my home office? And
well, I think you do need to end up saying this is the risk that you're taking, and if you do that and your data gets hacked, it's on you. If you put our sensitive data against our policy,
is it on them though?
Yeah, it will be. I think if someone at
does the
NIWA puts NIWA
reputational
data
risk
on the
go against that researcher or the institution that just
if
lost
someone at NIWA put sensitive
patient
NIWA data
records?
onto the cloud and it was found out and there would be consequences, as in job consequences. So those sorts of things are doable, but you do have to kind of back them up with teeth. But I think you don't. Before you get to that point, you do have to actually put a price on these things. It doesn't have to be a huge price, but people don't value things they get for free. And I think this is the reason why we charge for people to come to conferences. If I have a free event, people will sign up for it, and they won't turn up. The minute you put $5 on that, it's not going to break anyone's bank. But all of a sudden they go, actually, I've put some money on this. I better turn up and make the most of it. So it doesn't have to be a huge price, but it does need to be some price, I think.
Thanks, Wallace and the team, and we are in that together. But I wanted to drop a few questions as well in the mix, because there is nothing such as a black and white in this conversation about the data management. So the few questions that I have and keep thinking about it, is it like this is a today problem? And if it is a today problem, is it because the size of the data is not sufficient? You're trying to asking more researchers to come and access the service, then your space would not be sufficient. And then the other one is like around the content of what you have. It's like we wanted to get rid of the data. And is that if that is your problem, that needs to be taken in a different space. But also my question back to you is this will be your problem within the future growth that the university is looking forward to achieve in terms of the increase more research to happen? And if it is a future problem that will bring to the conversation toward the utilization of the data and what we need to do. So which position you are standing on in terms to articulate the problem based on the context that viewing it?
I think that's a question for broader than me, but as an
for everyone as well.
Engineering manager, we can keep building the array bigger. Dell will help us build the array bigger. But looking at it from a more strategic lens, where I'm sitting, it is a lot of money. We're spending a lot of money, a lot of the institution's money on this, and the institution's money is finite. So the money we spend on this doesn't go into other things. And we're talking multi-millions. We're not talking $100,000 or $10 here. We're talking multi-millions.
I think there was an interesting point made before around charging for much older data, because I think there's a real balance around wanting to encourage people to save current data, which I think you can turn around and have a policy where you go, in order to save any data, we've actually got some metadata requirements that you can't push save until these things have done, and you fill in these fields, which actually starts to create the right environment moving forward in terms of data management, and accepting that in fact that anything over 24 months you no longer fund it out of the IT department, and those actual costs then fall back onto the HODs, which means you then start to go, that forces them to have to make the operational trade-offs if they actually think that the information is important to retain. But I don't think you can get away from the fact that IT, given your point, which is actually if someone deletes something that they shouldn't, you need to be able to cover your butt where you go, this is the policy, and actually if you want assistance doing this, this is actually what we advise you do in terms of your alternative and your backup options. I don't think it's a one approach though. I think you've probably got about 3 different policy settings that need to apply.
Yeah, agreed.
Wallace, can I ask a question? I think there's a couple of horizons you could look at your problem on, and I think there's a lot of, it's very easy to look backwards at, here's what our storage looks like, and here's our mountainous problem. I think to solve that problem, you actually also have to look forwards and go, what would actually be the ideal system, or a system we think would work, and what do we want our researchers doing? Because I think you have to build it so they can come in some respects, but you also have to bring people along on the journey with you. So I think there's a really important part of all of this, of actually thinking, what do we need to have to make it simple for researchers, work for us, and what are the different bits of that need to be in place. Now that's not going to happen tomorrow, so it's not going to actually solve what you're saying is the problem, which is I have no money for the mountain of data that we have. So I think there's some things you can do short term. We actually have quotas, so people they might get it for free, but we do kind of also educate them.
We have quotas as well. Now ask me how hard it is to get the quota increased.
And so there is some conversations, I think, and that's kind of your short term. Actually, we need to have people thinking about, while it's not costing you money, it is costing the university, which means ultimately it is costing you money because it means you're not getting funded in some other way. So people, you know, the fast tier storage is you know, $4 a gigabyte versus the object storage, which is 40 cents, versus the tape storage, which is 4 cents.
You want a cluster of 100 A100? Sure, I can get that, but I have to take the money from somewhere else, you know.
So I think there's a bunch of education and a bunch of conversation and a bunch of work in that space, which is where I was coming from in the data cultures.
Yeah.
But I think not only that, there's actually another conversation around actually could we share the data in different ways and put it in other places so it's stored and backed up in the right way, but also more easily shareable, or, you know, what data can we publish and make available versus we have to keep behind walls. And I think there's a shift in that space as well, and actually helping people put data out there, or at least put a record of it out there and put it somewhere that's not there.
And I'm only showing you one of the storage solutions that the university has. So we also have Office 365. What comes along with that? Storage. Well, but at the moment, that storage is unlimited. For how much longer is it going to be unlimited? We already know. When does companies like Microsoft and that start to charge? Hint, they've already told us when they're about to charge.
Right.
It's soon.
I think this discussion points to a couple of critical failures in the way the funding system works too. That's the national picture and also the local one at universities. Yeah. In that, if I'm a researcher who gets a grant and I do some work and I gather some data and I want some storage from the data, okay, I'm bringing in overheads, that's great, you'll give me my storage, probably, or we'll lose the grant. Then I'm still writing papers, but the grant is finished. I'm not bringing in overheads anymore, but I still need to keep my data. Mm-hmm. So there is a point where I don't have money for this anymore because the grant stopped paying.
Yep.
I think that failure could be addressed by a bit more careful funding of grants. Something they do in the National Science Foundation in the USA now is if a grant has produced useful data and NSF decide, then they will also pay for the storage that that data needs for its lifetime. Something like that is needed for all of these data sets that have use more outside of a particular researcher's domain. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's interesting, because the thing that immediately springs to my mind is another problem that Darren has, which is research experiments that have been set up over the years. There's technology attached to those research experiments. The money ran out a long time ago, but the researcher's still working away on that gear, which is now running DOS 622. And there's no money to upgrade it or do anything, but this is also this person's whole life work and that very delicate conversation around we can't continue to support this Windows 95 machine that you have to have on the network.
I just mentioned one more thought, if that's okay. I'll do it in a loud voice. Where we're trying to get to at the University of Auckland, we're not there yet, is to be able to have a strategic level conversation with the Deputy Vice Chancellor of Research or his associate about what data we have, which means knowing what we have, and what is a priority for the university to keep in the long term. We'd like also to be able to do this with compute resources too.
Yes.
We're not spending $100,000 to get one more PhD. Well, or if we are, is that good use of our resources? We often don't know the answer to that question.
Yeah. Yeah, we struggle with that right now with high-powered workstations. Somebody wants a $10,000 workstation for their PhD student, and then the next week they would need another one and another one. We centrally fund all IT provisions, so that comes out of a central fund. That is a limited fund, you know, and having those hard conversations around, well, you say you can't use NESI, or you say you can't use our on-prem HPC, but could you really? Do you really need that? Yeah. But those are hard conversations, I will say, for IT to have, because we're immediately at a disadvantage. We don't know, we're not experts in the domain. So if you've got somebody there telling you that, no, this is absolutely critical and we have to do it this way, it's a difficult conversation for an IT person to have. Because you might be right. You may be snowing me, I don't know. Those are the difficult things that have to be dealt with.
It could just as well be that, well, both is right, in that from the researcher's perspective, it's much easier to do on the high-powered workstation.
Absolutely.
It could also be done on the HPC, but they would have to first work out how to run that remotely, how to run the command line version of it.
Yeah.
But they already know how to run it on a workstation with user interface, and they want their student to get moving quickly.
Yep. We find that a lot with people who've had access to a ton of like high-powered Macs or something like that. They know how to do it on a Mac. When it comes to, though, moving it over to NESI or something like that, that would require them to redo their workflows and redo that, and yeah.
A previous job that I had was in an IT department, and anyone that knows me will find that hilarious. One of the reasons that I was there is that they were interested in building the relationship between the service providers and the researchers. Now, you sort of alluded to this, but it seemed to me at the time to be one of the better ways to attend to this problem without going down free services or unvalued services, and therefore we need to charge for them, or mandates that force people to do training or other sorts of activities, but to incorporate it into your operational concern to understand how people were using your service. Now, it was resource intensive because it required you to go out and talk to the researchers, but we found it quite effective, particularly when we honed down onto maybe 3 key messages, one of which was, you'll have all this storage, but you're only going to have it for a short period of time. You need to think about what that's going to mean towards the end. And, you know, there are edge cases, but by and large, people said, yeah, okay, what do we do at the end of that? There's a separation of concerns, and you start talking about scaling sorts of activities and selection actually was a great way to introduce into the conversation the idea that actually reducing what you stick in there rather than your iTunes libraries and family photographs, but to actually start to think about what needs to be kept and what doesn't. Now, it wasn't as determined as that, but it was quite, it wasn't a passive, you get lots of storage, just keep on going, fill your boots, because we can't do that anymore. And we probably haven't been able to do that for about 18 months. Is there any plan for you to start thinking about that at Otago?
I'm going to let Darren answer that.
I'm minded to think that no one really understands the value of the data that's on the system.
What is the value that's there? How do I quantify the value of
how do you
this
demonstrate
system
the value?
other than I can tell you the hardware value, I can tell you the ongoing maintenance cost, I can tell you the FTE cost, but what's the actual value of the system and of the data that's in there?
That can change over time.
I'm sure it does change over time.
I have a question that sort of relates to what Darren answered, what Chase had on the, what Wallace even had on the slide, and what Max asked. What unit are you saving data in? Is it by a person, by a group, by a department, by a project? What are we talking about? Because Max, you were talking about
asking the hard
people.
questions and requiring us to fully open the kimono here. So this was put in place many years ago when IT was just starting to become central IT from a very decentralized thing. So no one really thought of any of these things. So we have people that are share owners. We have departments that are share owners. We have labs that are share owners. We have random groups of people that happen to be together that are share owners. We have all of the things. Now, in the last couple of years, we have transitioned to you have basically using the university's organizational structure is how, if you want to share, it needs to be within your department, it needs to be within your division and all that. So we have that cascading thing. But we also have a history of probably 6 years of not doing that. How many shares does Anatomy have? About 100. Yeah. That are all root shares.
Yeah, we're trying to move away from that.
Which tells us is a problem, by the way. We got too many root shares.
So we as an institution are trying to move to a projectization, which is painful. But that's what we're doing. Yeah. So there's a beginning, middle, and end of a project, and therefore the data can be tiered to slower storage based on that.
Yeah. Generally. And I think that ties very well into the work that Rasha and the team is doing around that research lifecycle management at the university. Because before that, a very complex eye-watering diagram that she had up earlier in her presentation was done, nobody had ever looked at that across the university. There was nobody that could tell you exactly how that worked within the university. There was no current state.
I would add to what Laura's saying in the sense that one of the things for us that we're looking at doing is thinking about, we know that some projects bleed into other projects. So sometimes you have a project, but it's then turns into another project. So there's sort of an active transition where sometimes we're trying to work with researchers to go, okay, well, this lot of data, I'm going to retain some of it because it's a new project, if you want to call it that. But I want to archive, this is a project I've done, and that comes back to the data management plan. You know, if it's a new thing, you might be reusing existing data, but it's a new project. So I want to archive this thing. So there's a difference between what I would say potentially tiering within an active system versus I want to save a version of this data and archive it, and that's where it gets potentially moved to a different system. And you might put metadata, you will put metadata around it. It might sit in an RO crate with that metadata. So I think there is a difference between tiering within a system and an actual archive for a project. And I think there has to be an active facilitation that's easy for researchers because researchers time poor, so you want to be able to go, boom, this is my data, I want to move it over to there.
If you are going to go that way with the metadata, do you archive it or do you publish it? Because really, if it's important, if it's valuable, it shouldn't sit in an archive. It should be published.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Because none of this data here is externally available or published in this state. This is an internal, mostly accessed through SMB file shares.
More of a comment than a helpful one. Before my current job, I worked in visual effects, and all of this is an unpleasant problem that happens in visual effects. And it's easier in visual effects because your movies go out the door and you can point to the scenes. And so this took a really long time to get right in the place I worked. And we dealt with big numbers like this. But the things that worked for us are going to be harder for you. Structured data. Deleting the intermediates is really important as well. You get a lot of stuff out of that one there. So being able to identify the intermediate type files and go, look, this stuff really needs to go. So it was a tooling you had to build up. It was the culture of making a responsibility of the person who owned either the research team or owned that shot. Say, you're responsible for this sort of, and giving the data to them. Having the data managers actively having the power to go, you know, the stuff can go. And it required a whole set of tooling and a whole group of teaming as well. The tiering did work, but it built on the success of the other stuff. The publishing worked, where you would say, this stuff goes forward, it all falls back. But this is all bringing me back to nightmares I had 20 years ago. And this is building it up from very small to very large very quickly. So,
yeah.
Whoa.
Very quickly.
Flashbacks.
Yes.
Not good.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we're going to cut it off here unless anybody has any last-minute words of wisdom they want to give. I hope that this was valuable for everyone else in here. Certainly valuable for me, but I simply wanted to put us up as a thing to be chewed up and spit out and discussed. And what I took from this is that y'all have given me the permission to go hit delete on all the light blue stuff, and if that goes badly, you're going to hire me, right? Okay, thanks everybody. Go enjoy drinks. Some social time.